Wel, noswaith dda I chi, dwi'n falch iawn o'r cyfle o allu ymuno gyda chi heno yma yn Llyfrgell y Sylfaenwyr ar gyfer y darlith agoriadol yr Athro Erickson. I'm so pleased to have the opportunity as Vice-Chancellor to join you here for this inaugural lecture for Professor Kyle. Scholarship is at the heart of this university, and the commitment to scholarship and of enhancing academic progression is key. And what we are doing tonight is starting on the tradition of inaugural lectures of our professors, new professors and associate professors of the university. And these will be established during this academic year and into the bicentenary year. Scholarship is at the heart of this university, and we will have the opportunity tonight to listen to the scholarship and to listen to how he professes in the context of his own academic area. Although I have to say, Provost, I was slightly concerned when I noted the content and the title of his lecture, when I saw it relates to succession planning, and in particular, how not to do it. I leave that to the Chairman of Council, but given that this university has already started on the process of succession planning, I will listen with great interest and I will certainly take notes. But tonight is about acknowledging academic excellence. It is an opportunity for us as a university, as a community that respects scholarship and enhances scholarship, to acknowledge the value of what Professor Kyle has done within his own academic discipline, of developing outstanding international world scholarship, and of advocating that scholarship in the name of the University of Wales, Trinity St David. I was so pleased that the Professorial Board were minded to make a recommendation to the Senate and to the University Council to acknowledge his academic contribution. And can I, on behalf of the university, thank you and congratulate you for your significant contribution to the work of this university. I'm also indebted to Professor Mike Fernando, who has developed over the last couple of weeks the Professorial Directory. And you will have a digital directory that allows us all online to celebrate the strengths of our new professors and associate professors. An indication, I believe, of the commitment of this university to develop and grow the talent of scholarship within Wales, Trinity St David. Gyda hynny o eiriau, ga I ddymuno dda chi, ac ai naw ofyn I Gwilym Dyfri I gyflwyno yr athro yn ffurfiol i'r Brifysgol.
Professor Kyle Erickson, who is originally from Los Angeles in California, joined the academic staff here in Lampeter in 2010. He graduated in history, Greek and Latin from UCLA before moving to the UK to undertake his master's degree and PhD at Exeter University. His doctoral studies focused on the legitimacy, religion and iconography in the Seleucid Empire in ancient history under the supervision of Daniel Ogden and Stephen Mitchell. His work was later published by Routledge under the title The Early Seleucids, Their Gods and Their Coins. He has published largely on the Seleucids and their coinage, but also on Alexander's legacy in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. During his time at the university, Professor Erickson has been head of the Department of Classics, Assistant Dean of Humanities, and is currently Director of Academic Experience. He enjoys life in Lampeter and is an active member of the community through his involvement with the Lampeter Round Table, and I'm reliably informed that he is part of the team that organises the annual fireworks display and the Lampeter Beer and Cider Festival. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to invite Professor Kyle Erickson to deliver the University of Wales Trinity St David's inaugural professorial lecture entitled Succession Planning, How Not to Do It, Alexander the Great and His Successors. Okay.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor, and thank you, Gwilym. So this is an incredible honor, and thank you. But the title is not deliberate, but picks up most of my work. But I will start with, so for most would-be dynasts, one of the most difficult acts is the ability to successfully transfer power from one generation to the next. For most kings or even modern dictators, this transfer only comes with their death. However, for power to be handed from one generation to the next without conflicts or collapse of those succession plans, both must be arranged and implemented carefully. Those moments of transition, even in established democracies, present opportunities for new groups to attempt to seize power and or destabilize the new regime. Today, I will first explore the aftermath of Alexander's failure to account for his own mortality and a failure to establish a viable heir. Secondly, I will consider a few Hellenistic examples to consider whether Alexander's heirs successfully managed what he could not. Now, in states without institutionalized processes for transferring power, a wide variety of options are available to establish a new legitimate regime by establishing the status of the new elite as the rightful rulers. In the case where a new power has overthrown the establishment, as was the situation with Alexander in Persia, there are several options available. First, the old power structure can be represented as illegitimate in an effort to reduce its status in light of the new elite. Secondly, an old power structure can be revived to the status of a golden age that has now returned. Or finally, new rulers can claim a new mandate to rule based on other factors, often divine support. Now, none of these possibilities are mutually exclusive, nor does employing any of these methods require that they match the reality on the ground. And of course, for those in power, the aim is to pass power successfully to a chosen successor peacefully and without conflict and without inviting any of those possibilities. Now, for example, the removal of the Persian yoke from Egypt by Alexander in real terms did not require the wholesale dismantling of the prior system of rule or the complete removal of all the major political players. Thus, the establishment of a new regime doesn't need to actually replace all of the old structures of power, but the process needs primarily to elevate the status of the new ruling elite and create the perception of change. For the successors of Alexander the Great, these problems were more acute and more complicated. First, the king they sought to replace had developed an uneasy balance between the Macedonian and Persian dynastic traditions. Further, he governed, much like his predecessors, the Achaemenids, through a range of subordinates, both Macedonian and non-Macedonian, whose loyalty he courted extensively or simply replaced. In many cases, these subordinates have developed their own basis of power in the regions with their own long dynastic traditions. Above all, the new empire was bound together by Alexander's personal charisma and his personal favor. As a result, after his death in Babylon on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, the ghost of Alexander continued to exercise an inordinate amount of influence over his successor's claim to power. So now let's turn to the roots of Alexander's failure. To do this, we cannot begin at the end of Alexander's reign, but rather we shall return to the beginning. And a few comments on Macedonian traditions are perhaps in order. This topic has been well covered in Alexander's scholarship, and much of what is discussed below was covered well by my supervisor, Professor Ogden, in his well-titled book, Polygamy, Prostitutes, and Death. For me, this topic has remained at the back of the majority of my work, as I've looked to explore the various ways in which the Seleucid dynasty, the largest of the successor kingdoms, attempted to express their legitimacy within the options outlined above. I've argued that in the past, the first attempts at Seleucid legitimation fell into a familiar pattern of attempting to claim the mantle of rule in a clear line of succession from Alexander. I and others have argued that as other dynasts more successfully exploited this line of succession, that Seleucus, his son and his court, looked to change the narrative and to place Seleucus as an equal, or at least a near equal, to Alexander and as the legitimate founder of his own dynasty. However, none of this would have been possible without Alexander's failure first. So while recent work has continued to elucidate Macedonian history prior to Alexander and his father Philip, most of our information on the monarchic practice comes from their reigns. That being said, there appear to be a few factors that define Argead kingship. The first and most important was that kingship in Macedon was linked intrinsically to the Argead clan. Secondly, that there was not a set pattern to succession. For example, the eldest son would not automatically take over in place of his father. Rather, rival branches of the family fought for power and were often supported by different foreign factions. Attempted regicide was common, and any Argead appears to be as good as any other. So despite this, Argead rule, so far as we know, began in the 7th century BC and only ended shortly after Alexander's death around 300 BC. So for 4 centuries. So if we look at Alexander's succession in light of the usual Argead infighting, there's considerable evidence that Philip worked to mitigate this issue. He worked to groom his son for leadership. Alexander, we know, entertained Persian ambassadors while Philip was in campaign. He studied under Aristotle. He took over the regency at age 16 when Philip was on campaign against Byzantium. And during his regency, he undertook his own campaign and founded a city within his own name. And finally, he commanded the cavalry at Philip's crowning glory at the Battle of Chaeronea when he defeated the Greeks. Alexander's image was also likely included in the monument that Philip established for himself and his family at Olympia. And it seems clear from our sources that Philip strongly favored Alexander over his half-brother Arrhidaeus. Now, the relationship between the two was not always without conflict, and the most notable conflict came to a head following Philip's marriage to Cleopatra, the daughter of Attalus. Now, in the banqueting that followed the wedding, Attalus claimed that the union between his daughter and Philip would give Philip a legitimate heir. And a drunken Philip and Alexander nearly came to blows, stopped only by Philip stumbling over the couch. Shortly thereafter, Alexander fled the country and was only recalled shortly before Philip's murder. Now, with Philip's murder, shortly before his own planned invasion of Persia, the typical pattern of Macedonian succession took hold. Alexander appears to have been in a prime position for rule, but he took immediate steps to eliminate all of his potential rivals. In addition to the swift execution, before he could even be questioned of Philip's assassin, Alexander removed his older cousin Amantis, the son of the former king Perdiccas III, the family of Alexander Lycentis, except for Alexander himself. And Alexander's mother removed Philip's most recent wife, Cleopatra, and her infant daughter by dragging them over a bronze vessel filled with fire. So typical bloody succession within an Argead dynasty. The removal of Attalus was most likely in support of Attalus's own father-in-law Parmenio, which came at the cost to Alexander of a number of significant offices within Alexander's command were occupied by Parmenio's family. So there was always a cost to making these decisions. So like all other Macedonian successions, Alexander ruthlessly eliminated all of the political rivals for the throne. Now, we'll skip Alexander's campaigns to the north and south immediately after taking power, but he successfully reasserted Macedonian control over the areas his father had conquered before turning his sights on Asia. Before he left, his advisors Antipater and Parmenio advised him to produce an heir prior to the campaign, but Alexander seemingly refused. It's likely that he trusted his own youth, and B, that he didn't want to give any more power to any of the Macedonian generals whose daughters he likely would have been forced to marry. So Alexander leaves for Asia unmarried and without an heir. In his conquests, which I assume are well enough known to pass over quickly, Alexander marries twice, once in Bactria, to a Sogdian noblewoman, Roxana, and once during the mass weddings at Susa in 324 to Stratyra, the eldest daughter of Darius, the previous Achaemenid king, and Parsitis, the prior Achaemenid king, Artaxerxes III. So the latter two marriages make him the son-in-law of both previous Persian kings. Now, perhaps had he lived longer, Alexander's marriages could have borne him potential heirs. However, after a short illness, he dies on a cloudy night, either on the 10th or the 11th of June, at the age of 32. And I take the wonderful manuscript in Aberystwyth as the example. On his deathbed, he gathered his closest companions around him, gave his signet ring to Perdiccas, and is claimed to have willed his kingdom to the strongest. Now, on his death, that normal Argead dynastic pattern should have taken over. But for the first time in 3 centuries, Alexander has failed to create the conditions for keeping power within the clan. First, he'd removed almost the entirety of the potential claimants to power on his own accession 12 short years previously. With the notable exception of his mentally deficient half-brother Arrhidaeus, there was not another adult male Argead left alive. Second, although Roxanne was pregnant, Alexander had thus far failed to produce a viable heir. This left the Macedonian army in Babylon with an unprecedented choice. And following a series of short internal conflicts, largely between the cavalry and the infantry, a solution was arrived at with Arrhidaeus and Roxanne's child, assuming it was male, being named joint kings under the joint regency of Craterus and Perdiccas. Now, in good Macedonian fashion, Roxanne removed both of Alexander's other wives quite quickly so that no potential heirs could be born. This arrangement, however, doesn't last, and over the next 40 years, Alexander's former commanders fought each other for the control of the conquered territory. Those final 2 members of the Argead dynasty never held any real power and remained controlled by various of Alexander's former commanders. Now, nor did any of those who controlled the 2 final Argead kings were they able to maintain their own power, and the Argead dynasty ceased to exist. Now, by the 280s, so 40 years after Alexander's death, 3 men who had served under Alexander had effectively forged new kingdoms from Alexander's conquests: Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Lysimachus. Now, as the majority of my work over the last 15 or so years has been exploring how Seleucus and his successors worked to create their dynastic image in light of their success and in reflection of Alexander, I will only briefly explore a few ideas that may be of interest. The first is the importance of establishing a potential successor, training them, and being able to trust them. The second is to establish structures that support the transition of power. And the third, which my work is largely focused on, is to create narratives of power around the dynasty that emphasize both the legitimacy of their rule, but also the benefits. The clearest lesson that the Diadochi, the successors, appear to have taken from Alexander's failure is the importance of having an heir in a position where they could take over command. The first and most notable instance of this comes when the first of the successors claims the title of king for themselves. In 306 BC, Antigonus the One-Eyed, the most powerful of the successors at the time, simultaneously named himself and his son Demetrius king. Here's an image of Demetrius. This sharing of the royal title between father and son until they were defeated by a coalition of the other diadochs, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus at Ipsus in 301, meant an effective sharing of power that the other potential kings could follow. Now, with Antigonus's death in that battle in 301 at the ripe old age of 81, the early power of the Antigonans was broken. And although Demetrius remained king without a kingdom and attempted to restore his family to power, he died nearly 20 years later as a captive at his new father-in-law Seleucus's court, without having regained a significant territory. Now, this practice of naming a son as a king was followed both by Seleucus and by Ptolemy. However, the potential naming of an heir was not as straightforward as the close relationship between Demetrius and his father. So before turning to the problem of choosing the right sons, there was the consideration of the potential successors had to make, which is the choice of the correct wife. Now, as we've seen, Alexander first married Roxanne in Bactria when he supposedly fell madly in love. This differed significantly from the 7 marriages of his father, who each time, except perhaps for his final marriage to Cleopatra, served to tie his conquest to the Argead clan and to him personally. For this reason, many have doubted that there was a political motive behind Alexander's marriage to Roxanne. His second and third marriages, both of the mass wedding of Susa in 324, a year before his death, to the daughters of the 2 previous Achaemenid monarchs, tied him firmly to Persian royalty and matched the pattern of his father. At this wedding, Alexander also married a number of companions to Persian and Iranian women, although the fates of these we are often unaware. It has long been assumed that Seleucus is the sole exception in keeping his Iranian bride, Apame, and Apame bears him his son and successor, the heir Antiochus. Although in fact, we only know the fate of one other, the wife of Amastris, who was divorced and then married to a dynast in Bithynia, where she ruled in her own right before being married a third time to Lysimachus, to whom we will return. Now, as is perhaps evident of this marriage pattern, the Macedonian elite were polygamous, and in the 2 years after the Battle of Ipsus, Seleucus marries Stratonice, the daughter of Demetrius Poliorcetes, the son of Antigonus Gonatas, and Philaea, the daughter of Alexander's regent in Macedon, Antipater. Now, this distinguished descent gave Seleucus a solid connection to several prominent Macedonian families. And the marriage of Stratonice to Seleucus completed another reversal of fortune to King Demetrius, who had 2 years been defeated by the coalition, which had been led by Seleucus and Lysimachus, and had subsequently driven him out of all of the territory he controlled. Now, in marrying Demetrius's daughter and thus allying himself to his former enemy, Seleucus was doubtless thinking of the model provided by Ptolemy's support for him when he had been forced to flee his own satrapy in the face of Antigonus's forces. For Demetrius, this marriage gave him a new powerful ally in the east to help him reassert his influence in mainland Greece and in Macedon. For Seleucus, however, the marriage provided an opportunity to secure the upper hand against his other former allies, Lysimachus, positioned to his north, and Ptolemy to his south, who had also joined their houses through marriage, with Ptolemy's daughter Arsinoe having married Lysimachus. Now, for Seleucus, this marriage does not cause long-lasting damage, although Seleucus and Stratonice do not remain married for overly long. The story about their marriage can be recorded in our sources can roughly be summarized as follows. Antiochus, the son of Seleucus, fell madly in love with his stepmother Stratonice, but also loved his father and didn't wish to compromise the relationship between the two of them. In attempting to hide his love, he falls ill and confines himself to his bed. Seleucus is so distraught at the thought of losing his son, he hires a doctor to find a solution. The doctor notices that Antiochus revives each time Stratonice came into the room, and although claiming the doctor tells a story that Antiochus was in love with the doctor's own wife, he manages to convince Seleucus for the good of his kingdom that the doctor should give up his wife, before revealing that it is in fact Seleucus's wife that Antiochus is in love with. Stratonice's opinion in the matter is nowhere recorded. Seleucus then forcibly marries Antiochus and Stratonice, names him as king, and sends both of them to the upper satrapies to rule in his stead. I believe and have argued that this coin is a representation of a representation of Antiochus and Stratonice on their tour of the upper satrapies. Now, for Seleucus, this marriage and public declaration of Antiochus's kingship solidified the potential succession within his kingdom and also gave Antiochus an apprenticeship as king. A similar step Ptolemy takes when he appoints one of his younger sons, Ptolemy Philadelphus, king sometime later in 285. Now, this led to discord at the Ptolemaic court when his older son, Ptolemy Keranos, went to join his sisters at Lysimachus's court, to the court which we will now turn. Now, the marriage of Lysimachus and Arsinoe, which I mentioned before, began along the same lines. Again, the daughter of one of Alexander's generals married one of his actual generals. But this marriage broke some family ties and created new sources of power that helped to end Lysimachus's hope of passing on power. Now, Lysimachus had previously been married to Nicaea, the daughter of Antipater, who again appears, Alexander, and she had borne him a son, Agathocles. He then married Amastris, who had been married to Craterus, and at least to one other wife prior to his marriage to Arsinoe in circa 299 BC. And he has 3 sons by Arsinoe. So Agathocles also marries the daughter of Ptolemy, a half-sister of Arsinoe, in circa 293 BC. Now, these complicated marriage alliances seem to have spelled doom for the house of Lysimachus. This dispute between the Ptolemaic half-sisters appears to have spilled over to their husbands. By 284, this family dispute had broken out to such a degree that Agathocles was executed by his father for treason, perhaps at the behest of Arsinoe. Agathocles had been popular, and his death removed the eldest and most accomplished of the potential heirs to Lysimachus, who was either in his 70s or his 80s at the time, and put the two Ptolemaic sisters on a collision course over potential heirs. Lysimachus had not done what Seleucus and Ptolemy had done in naming one of their sons as joint rulers. And a few years later, in 281, when Lysimachus also died on the battlefield facing off against Seleucus, his dynasty fell with him. So while this dispute ended badly for Lysimachus, Arsinoe survived the dynastic dispute and in fact managed to extend her own power. She first married her half-brother Ptolemy Keranos, likely while she was commanding the garrison at Cassandreia after Lysimachus's defeat. After her brother married her and husband married her murdered her two children by Lysimachus, she fled from him first to Samothrace and then to her brother Ptolemy Philadelphus in Egypt. Here she was deified and incorporated into the Ptolemaic royal cult, and her cult was also established in a range of Egyptian temples, and her worship continued for the rest of the Ptolemaic period. So in a way of offering a few brief thoughts as a conclusion, the problem with passing powers in dynasties is in part luck of having both capable children who live to the right age and who are willing to take a chance, or willing to wait for a chance at the throne without trying to take it from you. Too few children can be as bad as too many, and too many different competing family lines can always cause problems. Perhaps the best advice remains to have an heir and a spare. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Would you be happy to?
Yeah.
Any questions? So, do you have any questions to Professor Erickson this evening at the end of the intriguing lecture?
That's a question and more a comment. One, PTSD flashbacks to my undergrad. Two, I had forgotten how much of Game of Snakes and Ladders the dynastic relationships between the successors were. Like, everybody was related to everybody else.
Yep. So like European monarchs post the sort of Habsburgs, all of the successors marry constantly in between all of the families, mostly multiple times, and each of them seems to be tied to some who's in favor with who at each point. And as they fall in and out of favor, both women and their husbands, and some of the reason Antiochus might get sent off the upper satrapies with his wife is to hide Stratonice away from her husband as her husband's approaching. So there are elements of actually marrying into these families also create potential heirs and claims. And we see this all the way through the Hellenistic period. So by the time we get to the very end of the Hellenistic period, where you've intermarried between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids for a couple of generations, when Antony is looking to give territory to Cleopatra's children, he gives them all of the Seleucid territory. Not that he happens to control it at the time, but in a famous donation that Octavian says Antony's effectively abandoned being Roman, he gives over the old Seleucid Empire to Cleopatra's children on the basis of family claims. So all of these family relationships are never quite forgotten, but they always seem to cause trouble.
How long did it take for the gene pool to become ankle height? All that information.
It is a fair number. It is a fair number of different families that begin it, and the Macedonian elite was fairly wide. The Seleucids start marrying into the Iranian elite, both outwards and inward later in the dynasty, whereas the Ptolemy's solution to these problems is at least officially having your primary wife come from within the same family, even if the children don't, because then you don't create the problems of potential outside forces being able to claim power if power is held between brother and sister. And that really starts with that marriage between Ptolemy, the second Ptolemy Philadelphus, and Arsinoe.
Please, Dr. just ask a question. You focused on the Seleucids, so that one part of the Alexander's area. And obviously, equally interesting things are going on back in Macedonia and in Egypt. How is this all overlapping and interacting in sort of family connections and things as you move into the wider Alexandrian territories?
So they marry fairly consistently within each other, at least for the early period. Macedon remains sort of chaotic after Lysimachus dies. So I've ignored Cassander, who Antipater's son Cassander doesn't take over and isn't given power after his death. Antipater assigns Polyperchon to that role, at which point Cassander decides that's inappropriate and wages a war against Polyperchon, and ties in Olympias and various others into that war. So another fairly good example of poor succession choices. That dynasty falls out. It's effectively replaced by Lysimachus, who defeats them. When Lysimachus dies, Seleucus attempts to invade Macedon. Ptolemy Keranos, who switched sides from Lysimachus to Seleucus, stabs Seleucus in the back. He then goes and tries to literally stabs him in the back, and then tries to take Macedon, at which point the Galatians happen to arrive and kill him. And it takes another 10 or 15 years before Demetrius's other son, Antigonus, manages, having been nowhere, to raise an army and actually take Macedon. And then you have a sort of reestablishment of that dynasty coming back 20 years later, having lost all power. So it's fairly bloody and messy. But there does seem to be a system of using marriage alliances to secure these alliances between the.
And the Ptolemies seem to go into an Egyptian sort of marriage sort of approach.
Yep. And when they do it to the Seleucids at the end of the Third Syrian War, it causes chaos for the Seleucids because they manage to set up two competing branches of the family, who both then have adult children, and then they launch a civil war. So having two sets of adult children seems to be especially problematic.
You mentioned it very briefly, and it's slightly off topic, but did Alexander assassinate his father? Because him showing up shortly afterwards is might.
It's shortly before. There's a whole bunch of suggestions.
Alexander shows up and then his dad dies. Then he takes over. Like that seems a bit like a smoking gun.
Alexander and Olympias are the people who benefit most from Philip's death. There's a very swift investigation in which the assassin acts alone and is executed by Alexander's guard when he's attempting to escape. And then there is no investigation further than that, and Alexander effectively brushes it under the carpet as quickly as he can. A large amount of scholarship does suggest that Alexander may have had a hand in arranging his father's death, which wouldn't be surprising. There are also bits that Craterus and the other successors, Antipater's son Cassander in particular, may have had a hand in arranging Alexander's death. Because Craterus seems to have been sent to replace Antipater as regent in Macedon, but never quite gets there and seems to sit with his army in Asia Minor until Alexander dies, without ever returning to Macedon. So the attempt to replace many of these generals also can lead to their assassination.
Friendly lunch.
Angus.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, is there much kind of moral opprobrium attached to fratricide and patricide in this year, or is this all just kind of expected kingly norms?
Both expected and some moral questioning of it. It depends on the author. So Plutarch, interestingly, who's famously moralizing, tends to not pass judgment on this sort of dynastic succession of murders, but you do have others, particularly where things go badly. The abandonment of filial pride and filial relationships is the cause of downfall. So in the war between Seleucus II's two children, Justin is moralizing on the inappropriateness of two brothers fighting and the causes behind that. So you do get a certain amount of moral condemnation of certain types of conflict. But there seems to be an acceptance of when people are fighting for the throne, people wind up dead. As sort of de facto norms.
You talked a lot about planning. What about legacy? There's all this bloodthirsty fighting, but you think about Alexander the Great in terms of his legacy. To what extent does this contribute to it, or is it a hindrance to it in terms of the expansion of Greek and Hellenization in the ancient world?
He becomes the figure to which everyone becomes compared. And in the different empires, he is the figure who, at least initially, gives the legitimacy to each of his successors. So like Symmachus's coinage features Alexander on it. Ptolemy has Alexander's body, and Alexander becomes the first figure in the Ptolemaic dynastic cult. So the Ptolemies firmly plant their house within a succession of Alexander. And in fact, Ptolemy probably seems to at least lay hints around that he's actually an illegitimate son of Philip and therefore a brother of Alexander. So there are attempts to tie that in. I've argued that Seleucus starts in that vein, but he's half a generation younger than the others. And was never as high in Alexander's offices as Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Antigonus, etc., and doesn't have quite that same connection with Alexander. And I think that Antiochus moves the narrative, and you get a large number of stories about Seleucus that parallel the stories you get about Alexander. That Seleucus attempts to overtake Alexander in that role as founder, and the legitimacy narratives in the Seleucid Empire are not Alexander based, but Seleucus's own origin based. So Seleucus gets his own divine birth story. He's the son of Apollo. He founds more cities than Alexander. He takes all of the territories with Alexander. He gets a whole bunch of sort of ritual bits that you see paralleled in Alexander that are scattered through our sources. So it looks like there's a deliberate strategy to move away from Alexander's legacy as part of the empire in the Seleucid Empire. That's definitely not there in Macedon or in Egypt. Although Macedon at some point starts to look back to Philip II rather than to Alexander, but still to the Argians to pull them together.
Yes, thank you for that lecture. But yes, I wonder if, sort of tying to that, what would be your take on why do the Susa weddings not seem to work out in that sense? Is it similar in terms of moving away from something Alexander had a hand in setting up, or is it something else, do you think?
I think it's something else, and I think it's one is Greek ethnic bias. Particularly for those who are focused on returning to Greece and power based in Greece and Macedon. So Craterus giving up his Iranian bride is likely based on his wanting to return to Macedon family there and do that. And I think it's just a large gap in our sources. A large part is because we know the names of very few of these women, and we also don't know what happens to most of them. And none of the men they're married to either live long enough to be powerful in and of themselves, or sort of disappear into the satrapies. We don't know if they remain married, so either they remain sort of with their husbands, particularly if they remain in the East, or as they attempt to go back to Greece, there's an incentive to get rid of them. And I think the other counter narrative there is the importance of each other's daughters and sisters as marriage tokens in the conflict. The Iranian nobility seems to disappear from most of the early Hellenistic conflict in the West. Now, some of that's source bias, but if you're marrying the daughter of Antipater, she's more important than the Iranian bride for the context in which they're competing with each other. So those marriages become more important. The interesting ones who are ignored are Alexander's sisters, who do attempt to go marry themselves off to the successors and are ignored as slightly, perhaps too risky, particularly in that early period where nobody's quite willing to claim the kingship before 306. So being too directly tied to Alexander can be as dangerous as pretending that the Argead dynasty is just existing, even after they're all dead.
Thank you. If you could kindly go into the chat facility. I understand there are 3 questions there for you. Could be all right.
So Rebecca asks, how much of Aristotle's teachings do you think might have influenced Alexander's choice when it came to his mindset on the idea of his successor? I think Aristotle has a profound influence on Alexander, although not particularly on his idea of succession. I think Alexander is convinced he's going to live for a very long time and really isn't concerned with it. I think that's why he ignores marriage. He's fairly young when he sets out for Asia and thinks he has time. And even at the end of his life, he's only 32. So for a Greek male of that time, he's still fairly young to be married. And he's been on campaign since he left Greece for the previous 12 years. So I think it's just not been the forefront of his thinking. The other questions of whether or not Alexander is gay may have an influence on that, but he does produce heirs, and he does have a mistress who produces a son, Heracles, who kicks around for a while, but no one thinks is legitimate. So I think Alexander is mostly uninterested in this and was more concerned with his elite circle around him. And the second one is it's interesting to see powerful women marrying into Hellenistic lines, given that the Hellenes were not known for ruling women. Does this spread back to the Western provinces all, or does it just hold for the Ptolemies and Seleucids? It spreads to all of them. I think it's interesting that there seems to be a feature of monarchy, particularly in this period, where women, as part of a ruling family, are able to what's the right word? To express their power more forcefully as part of a dynasty than they are within traditional Greek male polis culture, and that we have particularly powerful women. Alexander's mother, Olympias, Philip Aridaeus, his wife Eurydice, in fact, leads an army against Olympias in Macedon. So you get a series of powerful women. And also in the succession crisis, the ability to bear children and have them and raise them is particularly powerful. So they become significant in all of the dynasties and use this effectively to assert their own power and to defend their children. And that's the same question.
Any other questions or comments at this stage? One further comment.
I'm just interested in that if the Macedonian elite were polygamists, then the concept of illegitimate children seems a bit strange in that sense. But I can get it from an alliance sense that they would want them to be within more legally recognized bounds. But I just find it interesting that they seem to have gotten caught up on that rather than.
Well, polygamy doesn't seem to also exclude having mistresses outside the polygamous marriages. So most of these will have both multiple marriages, which seem to be largely political, and also mistresses. Now, Demetrius has a large number of both of them. So it's the children born to mistresses who might be illegitimate. Now, whether or not they attempt to make claims that they are legitimate and to assert the rights for their children to rule does happen as well. There's also questions that seem to emerge mostly later in the Hellenistic period, but you might raise them about Ptolemy II, of the Roman phrase being born in the purple, so i.e. whether or not the next legitimate king is the one who is born when their father is king, rather than ones who might be born before their father was king as well. So there's questions about birth order as well, and when people are born, but it doesn't seem to influence particularly either early or mid-Hellenistic bits. And by the late Hellenistic period, everybody's attempting to be king, so it doesn't really matter anyways. And tarring your opponent when there's 4 of you from various versions of the same family as illegitimate, fighting for power, it's a useful tool.
It just seems like a very funny distinction.
Thank you very much indeed for those questions and comments. I have no intention whatsoever to refer to the title of this evening's lecture. However, on your behalf, I would like to thank Professor Kyle. On your behalf here, obviously in the audience this evening, but also those of you who've joined us virtually this evening, for such an informative and insightful lecture. That really was a masterful presentation. Thank you very much indeed. Those of us who work with Professor Erickson on a daily basis and have regular Teams meetings with him will have, on several occasions, been mesmerised by the colourful fish, the tropical fish in the tank behind his desk. So this afternoon, I can honestly say that we've been mesmerised as an audience through both his expert knowledge and enthusiasm for his subject, and his ability to share that knowledge with us in such a fascinating and enlightening way. Felly diolch yn fawr iawn i'r Athro Erickson, a mae'n cyfareddu a'i arbenigedd a'i ddawn dweud, gan drafod testun awdd o bosib yn ddiethyr i rai ohonon ni yma heno mewn arddull hwyliog a difyr dros ben. Before I invite Professor Erickson and the Vice-Chancellor to enjoy a well-earned cup of tea, may I remind you that the second professorial lecture will be delivered by Professor Louise Steele here on the Lampeter campus in November, date to be agreed, that's my understanding, and the title of her lecture will be An Archaeological Odyssey o Gaza I Gymru. Gyfeillion, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi gyd am eich cefnogaeth a'ch presenoldeb yma, prynhawn yma. Fe'i gwerthfawrogwyd yn fawr iawn. Thank you, one and all, for your support this afternoon. I'm sure that you'll agree with me that the university's inaugural lecture series has got off to a very, very good start. The bar has been set very high, I would say. Diolch yn fawr iawn.